In the 48th episode of the Mindfulness and Grief podcast, Ron Mathias talks to us about the art of visualizing grief, translating pain into pictures. The Mindfulness and Grief podcast is brought to you by Awaken, my meditation for grief program that helps you cope with the heartache and pain of loss with mindfulness-based practices for your body, mind, and spirit. Join Awaken to participate in weekly meditation for grief groups. Access the complete mindfulness and grief course library that features guided meditations and streaming video, and connect with people who understand what you're going through in our live sessions. Grief is hard enough. You don't have to do it alone. Learn more and join the community at meditationforgrief.com. I am your host, Heather Stang, author of Mindfulness and Grief and the guided journal From Grief to Peace. If you find this podcast helpful, please click on the subscribe button so you'll be notified of future episodes. And leave a review so other people can find the Mindfulness and Grief podcast and benefit from the teachings. Ronald Mathias, CMI, has been immersed in medical media production and visual translation for over 25 years. During that time, he has created thousands of innovative, demonstrative aids for personal injury, medical malpractice, and product liability cases for plaintiff and defendant attorneys across the United States. He also provides artwork for medical textbooks, journals, medical device advertising, comic books, and storyboarding for film. Ron has lectured on the practical use of demonstrative evidence at Temple University, St. John's University, the New Jersey Association for Justice, the New York State Trial Lawyers Institute, and many local bar associations. Previously, he taught biomedical art and visualization at Rowan University in Glassboro, New Jersey. One of his passions is teaching the fundamentals of art, particularly phi ratio design theory, to evoke specific emotional responses from the viewer. He is a graduate of the Rochester Institute of Technology's Medical Illustration Program and maintains board certification from the Association of Medical Illustrators. Ron founded the studio Anatomical Justice, LLC, in Pennsylvania in 1999. Ron is also the illustrator of the cover of the textbook Superhero Grief, which you may have heard me talk about during my interview with the editor Jill Harrington. I myself contributed a chapter called Mindfulness as Your Superpower. Well, I'd like to welcome Ron Mathias to the Mindfulness and Grief podcast. And those of you who are frequent listeners will have heard Jill Harrington and I talk about the book Superhero Grief, The Transformative Power of Loss, which I contributed the chapter on mindfulness as your grief superpower. And Ron illustrated the cover. Welcome to the podcast, Ron.
Thank you so much, Heather. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
So one of the things that it can be helpful when people are going through a difficult time or are grieving is having an image to kind of concretize feelings. Mm-hmm. Whether it's something they draw themselves or, they work with an art therapist or do collage. You work in a field where you're actually creating images for court cases and people who've had traumatic injuries. Can you talk to us a little more about what you do? And we'll start with that.
No, and absolutely, no problem. So essentially what we do and the field itself is medical illustration, but it encompasses all things translating medical media or medical, whether it's surgical procedures or it's a cellular process, anything that involves medicine. What we're doing is we're translating it from the very complicated written descriptions into a visual medium that allows anyone to understand it. Now, it depends upon your audience. So sometimes your audience is a lay audience. So you would say someone who just doesn't really understand anything about this particular medical process. And then you have someone where you're translating it to a physician, or you're translating it to someone who is very high up in their particular field. So it all depends on your audience. So I don't necessarily like to say illustrator or artist. I also was a professor for a number of years, and I'm trying to get back into it. I'm going back for my master's degree. But at this point, when I was a professor, the one thing I used to tell my students all the time is that you're not really artists, you're translators. You're taking something from a complex idea and then bringing it into a visual medium. So the old adage of a picture being worth 1,000 words is kind of where we're going. You know, we want to be able to just somebody should be able to see it and understand it in 2 seconds. Right. And that's kind of where what I do. I do mainly deal with litigation, so we get to see a lot of the injuries that happen to a lot of people within a particular accident or a medical malpractice case. And one of the things that I'm trying to do, there's a clinical aspect to it. That's a big part of it. So the attorney is there trying to explain what happened to this person, and you can have a physician up on a witness stand describing everything that they went through and going on and on about all the medical aspects of it. And after about 5-10 minutes, people glaze over, and then it's either over their heads or it just becomes too dry. The translation process is really a means of conveying empathy, really. And you're trying to get someone through a visual medium to understand the pain and suffering that they had gone through. And you can describe it. And if you're a good orator, you can describe it very well. I mean, that's something that you can really translate. But it takes time. It takes time to describe it. But with a picture, you can do it instantaneously. And you can really be able to pass along that pain through the visual medium to saying, this person, this is what they went through. And it's just not enough saying it. Showing it really is an important part of it. But it can't be something that's interesting about litigation is that you can't have it be a gore fest. I mean, you can't have this thing that's, that would sway the jury one way or the other. It has to be impartial. So, or it has to be clinical. But it still can pass along that empathetic feeling that this person went through this, and it's something that you should take into consideration when deciding on a verdict for this particular individual. So I think it's an important part of not only as an artist, and one of the things I talk about with my students was that a lot of them feel lost. A lot of students, art students, when you're dealing with art therapy, I think that one of the things is you're trying to bring out something that's internal and put it into a visual medium so that not only the therapist can discuss it with you, but you can possibly translate something that you're not speaking. I see that a lot with the students. A lot of their anxiety, pain that they've gone through at home, or things that they're going through at the time, it comes out in their work. And you see it in the way that they do their work. You see it in some of them that are more confident can get it out, but some of them, the actual technical skill of doing the artwork is in itself part of their anxiety.
Kind of the process. The process itself shows it.
Yeah. And in the process, they're trying to find their way as artists. And one of the things that I want to try to impart in looking back into history with different artists, one of the things that artists like to do is they would say, well, I'm just going to make this thing, whatever the art is, whether it's a sculpture or painting, and then everybody's just going to buy it and they're going to love me, and I'm going to just get tons of empathy from everybody's love of my work. And then you end up being like Rembrandt or Van Gogh, where you die penniless and alone and being very sad because you're not getting, people aren't really reaching you. And there's something lost in that process. Today, though, I think that one of the things that you can do is that you can have purpose in your work. You can have purpose in your art that combines having a talent and aiding someone in society and being able to say something that gives your work something beyond you. And in that purpose, and I especially apply this to medical illustration, in that purpose of being able to translate to for someone that they went through this process, and I can translate their situation and their pain into an image that then conveys it to someone else, has given me so much more than just the talent and the work. It has in it an ability to transcend just talent or art. It has a meaning, and that's something that I feel as an artist, most artists want. You want to be able to reach someone on some level and communicate something, but what? So that's one of the things that I love about what I do.
I also wonder if what you do, if the end result, well, I'm also curious about your process, but I'll circle back to that in a moment.
Sure.
But visualizing empathy, basically.
Yeah.
How does that impact the victim, the person whose case is being discussed? Are you ever allowed to hear what they feel about your work, or is that not allowed?
Well, no, it is. It depends upon this. This is an interesting point when you're depending on what it is. We only get certain amounts of information based upon HIPAA laws and so on and so forth. But when you're dealing with something like a neurological condition, those are the cases where you really delve into the psychology of the patient, because a neurological injury can be very bad. It can be something, whereas, you have a massive head trauma where someone has a lot of fractures and bleeding and stuff that's very visually impactful, and you can see it and you can put it up and someone will go, oh my God, that's absolutely horrible that happened to that person. But there's also the cases that really get me, and they all do in some respect. The ones that really get me are the ones that are the subtle ones, the ones where I read a neuropsych report and it states, the person get into a car accident and then they were one way in the accident, but because you have essentially a small tears between the cell, the neural cell, and its connection, essentially. I don't want to get too technical. So you can have a massive brain injury without anything showing up on an MRI or a CT. So you can't see it, but a neuropsych will be able to see these problems. And this is where what we do really comes in from an empathetic perspective, because I'm reading these reports and it says, my children notice that I'm not the same.
Yeah.
I was in an accident, and then now I'm curt and I'm losing attention and I can't spend time with them the way I did, and my memory is shot. Those are things that are very difficult to render because now you have to figure out a way to really show this person's degradation and empathize with them. And there's nothing physical that you can see because it's on a cellular level.
This kind of brings us to grief, because not only is grief heartache and emotion, but there are cognitive changes that we experience, usually relatively short term, but things like irritability and forgetfulness and things like that that are sometimes a little hard to either put your finger on or that are not credited as being grief. But yet it is.
Right.
And so I'm thinking for someone, and I'm going to ask you to put your art teacher hat on for a second, if you don't mind.
Sure.
For people who are listening who maybe can't find the words to explain how they're feeling, or maybe they have the words, but might want to externalize it or process it in a different way. How do you go about rendering, and I don't mean technically necessarily, but rendering empathy?
It's a difficult, it's easier, I think, from a medical standpoint, because there are certain colors and there's certain views that you can use to depict those things. But one of the things I like to discuss with my students is that, and this goes back to Jill's cover of the book. The cover of the book, obviously we can't see it now, but
it'll be on the show notes page, by the way. Mindfulnessandgrief.com. Click on the podcast button.
Please do. The cover to the book, which doesn't have the entire image, but it has a superhero at a grave, kneeling before a grave. And the entire point is that the trauma of death affects these superheroes in a way that completely changes their outlook on life, and what they do after that death then propels them to live a particular existence. I had to figure out a way to translate that in a visual medium. So it's easy to say, well, I'm just going to stick a superhero next to a grave and that's the end of it. But that isn't the case. So and this technique is not taught in schools much anymore. There's still a few old dogs and not as old dogs like myself that do teach it. But it is taught in Europe. It's taught more, I think, than here in the States. It's essentially using what is called a golden ratio theory. And it's using mathematics and geometry to show movement on a page. And that movement can denote different types of emotional feelings. So when you look at a page, an 8.5 by 11 page, let's say, from each corner of the page, you can draw a large X connecting both corners. Now, in art, those two directions, both one side of the X and the other side of the X, denote both what is called the sinister and the baroque. The sinister is the line that moves from the top left-hand corner down to the right. And the baroque is from the bottom left-hand corner up to the right. And those two directions denote, generally in art, the movement from the descent or moving towards hell, and the ascent, moving towards heaven. You can see that in every single piece that uses this technique. All Western and actually all world art uses this as a foundation, using the golden ratio as a foundation to denote any type of emotion. And it is the movement within this geometric structure. So it's actually how I was taught, and I was taught the English method. It's a balance, and you're giving tribute to both Apollo and what was this?
Is it Hades?
No, it's not Hades.
Am I totally way off here?
No. Apollo, because it's Greek mythology.
Okay.
So you're giving tribute to two Greek gods. You're giving a tribute. The first Greek god is Apollo, and that's structure and order. The lines on the page, straight lines within the phi ratio, which is 1 to 1.618, or you can use the Fibonacci sequence, which is the same. The order of these lines denotes the structure that allows you to have the organic curves of Dionysus within which is structured within those lines. So any piece of art, any piece of Western art, as I said, any art throughout the world utilizes this structure. And the main focus of utilizing this structure is to denote particular emotions. And depending on the direction that the curves flow, you can have an exalted view where you have someone moving up towards heaven, going on the Baroque, or you can have a very, not necessarily depressing, but you can have someone moving towards destruction or hell or whatever it is that you want to do, or saying a depressive view of something or a sad view of something by having something on the sinister. So by using those two structural constraints in art, you can convey any emotion. Now, instinctually, everyone understands this, because the golden ratio is throughout all of nature, from the petals to a flower, to the structure of a galaxy, to the human DNA. They all comport to this ratio, as well as the human anatomy. Human anatomy is very much within this ratio. So it's innate in us. So let's say someone doesn't understand this. They're just trying to denote an emotion and trying to get something out of their system that allows them to put their emotions on page. They will instinctually do these things without understanding they're doing. And if you're a therapist and you understand this dynamic, then you can almost draw that emotion out depending on what it is that they're putting down. You can kind of see where they're going with their pain and their emotion. So the two, mathematics, art, and science, they all work in tandem. It's a fascinating subject that I could talk about for hours on end, but as long as I remember, it would, I think, would be helpful. Now, going back to the book cover, I thought about all of this. I thought about the fact that you can't just have the superhero on the sinister, because he's not necessarily he's reflecting. So it has to be both. There has to be movement through the image that allows the viewer to see the cover, come down and understand from the sinister that he's in a graveyard, and see him at the grave, kneeling before the grave, and then move using these curves of Dionysus through his due deference to the grave, and then move back up. I use his cape to move the viewer back up, curve back around, and then ascend again into heaven. So his deference to his lost loved one is the thing that brings him to the point where he has to change. And the change is, of course, getting to acceptance, as we all do when we have to deal with grief, which is what the goal is. And having to come back up and then use the Baroque to come back up to heaven. So when we're defining it in those terms, in those artistic terms, and we're dealing with these golden ratio terms, that's what I was trying to convey. The problem is that the cover got cut in half.
No, that's what's so sad. And with your permission, I'm hoping I can put the full illustration on the website, because I know on the cover, the way the layout is with the book title, we don't get the full view.
No, but I'd be happy to
that would
post
be
the full
great
image, so it's a little easier for people to understand when they hear the podcast. So yeah, it's and everything that I do when it comes to actually doing a medical exhibit for a patient, for a client, whether it's a medical, if they get a physician, but mostly for the legal clients. I keep this in mind. It's something that has to be incorporated into every single illustration that I do. So you have to move the viewer through each surgical step or each injury in a way that allows to not only explain it clinically, but convey the empathy that is needed to really be impactful. It's not just a matter of slapping things on the page. It just doesn't work.
Well, right, because you could have picked some clip art of Superman and a gravestone and
it just doesn't.
But it doesn't. Yeah,
doesn't work.
The image definitely has some weight, and so I'm also kind of wondering how much our and this is going to probably be not medically correct because we have things called mirror neurons, right? So like if I'm looking at you and your face is showing pain, my face might take on, the same shape of pain and I'll feel your pain. That's part of our human empathy contract, so to speak, where we can feel each other's pain and it's those mirror neurons that fire that. Or if, one thing I was taught as a yoga therapist is while I'm working on a client is to look at their body and imagine what the position they're in would feel like in my body. And that gives me some proprioceptive empathy. And even sometimes with their eyes closed, there have been times where I've moved my body to similar positions so I can really think, how are they feeling? And be like, wow, I wonder if their lower back's hurting because if I move into that position, that's what happens to me. And I wonder with the artwork for someone viewing it, if it's that just human connection, like for instance, with our superhero on the cover of this book, you do feel, when I think about your, sinister line.
Yes.
By the way,
Baroque,
everybody, my bachelor's degree is in art history, and I know all about the golden ratio. I never learned, or I skipped class the day they talked about the Baroque and the sinister because I'm like, wow, this would have been really great for a few papers I wrote. But like naturally as humans, when we experience like sadness or trauma, we usually do feel heavy and, you can see this, the podcast listeners can't, but I'm thinking about heaviness and my body kind of collapses, right? Or when we're feeling hopeful or transformed, we're lifting up.
Yeah, the body language is completely different, right?
Right. And when you're talking about the sinister and the Baroque, that's mirroring how the body feels in those two things. Okay.
Renaissance art is notoriously amazing for this.
This is what I was thinking about. I was like, oh my gosh, because pictures of I have all these images flashing in my head where I can totally see this playing out.
Yeah, it was taught. This was sort of common knowledge up till the 60s, I think. Anyone who has studied this particular discipline, what they used to do was there was no college you went to for art. It was a student or let's say an apprenticeship. Yeah, it was an apprenticeship. So you would go to the master, you would stay with him or her in that particular field. You would learn their geometric shapes that they would use. Those tributes to Dionysus and Apollo, the golden ratio and the curves. There's a very good book called The Painter's Secret Geometry. I try to pitch it as much as possible because it goes into this particular lost art, and it's not lost. I don't want to say it's lost because there are plenty of people who use it. You go any movie poster, Disney book cover. If you look at any Disney thing that's done as far as a poster or piece of art, and most comic book artists use it regularly. A lot of artists do still use it, but they don't talk about it because it's kind of like a trade secret thing. And certain people want to use it for themselves to make their artwork look better. But the problem I have with that is that it's not really taught to students. And it is the foundation of all art. And without that way of conveying emotion in a way that ties into both nature and the mathematics of nature and humanity, without that knowledge, you're rendering something that has no meaning or purpose. It's just a jumble of lines and shapes. And I probably would be at odds with most people in my field where they would say anything is art. I disagree. I do think that because human nature and humanity has this innate understanding without knowing what it is, that everything has a proportionality and a meaning from a mathematical perspective. There are certain things that work. You see a piece of art and you go, my God, there's something about that that really speaks to me. And then you see something that is just random without any meaning. And you go, it's not really my thing. And again, everybody, different tastes for different people. I understand that. But not everything has that purpose and drive and meaning. And that's really what I want to try to impart with my work and impart to the students, because this aids them in allowing them to portray the emotions that they need to get out. They're a lot of them are going through the grieving process. I just had a student today whose mother just passed away. And he is a brilliant student. And this is something that I know that art, and he's an artist, a very good artist, and translating this into something that being able to put that pain down on the page would be very helpful, and I think would be helpful for a lot of people. But understanding this from this perspective allows it to communicate it even more.
I also think it gives people a starting point, because nothing is more intimidating than a blank piece of paper, whether you're an artist or a writer or, whatever you do. I'm even thinking like an empty pair of knitting needles can really freak me out. But even just saying, okay, I'm going to start with a 8.5 by 11 piece of paper. I'm not an artist. I've never drawn before. Okay, start on that descending line of the sinister in the lower corner, and maybe just start with something there, feeling in your body the weight of the emotions, and then maybe for the processing part or the moving into the if you're early in grief, if you're like me, you might not be quite ready to go into that transformation piece, which is what you're talking about, the cape of the superhero. Because the whole point of the superhero grief book is to show how the tragedy and the loss of our superhero characters leads to a transformation of sorts.
Right. And one of the fascinating things about this, and this is just I've been a comic book geek since the 1970s. So one of the things that's fascinating about the Superman character, and it's automatically the book cover is sort of associated with him, because a lot of people associate it with the films where you have Glenn Ford, who passed away in the original Superman film. That one really struck me when I was a kid. His death was very, I always liked the actor. But I love that film. It's one of my favorite superhero films. And you see, it's such a big part of Superman and him changing to become who he was after Pa Kent passed away. One of the things that's interesting from the comic book realm is this idea that in the comics, though, Pa Kent is still alive. Both mother and father are still there. But where they start to explore different views of Superman in death, not necessarily his death, but other people around him. So there's secondary stories. There's one that was very good that I was thinking about today before we came on, where instead of the comic is called Speeding Bullets, and it's a one shot by DC. And instead of Superman crashing into the field with the Kents, the ship went off course and it crashed into Wayne Manor. And instead of him being raised, like they never had Bruce Wayne. So instead of him being raised by the Kents, he was raised by the Waynes.
Wow.
So yeah, which is a cool story. And this starts to play into this idea of nature versus nurture. Is Superman, is the person that he is his soul, is it genuinely empathetic? Does he have that balance between empathy and sort of not self-serving narcissism, but yeah, I think a lot of the problems in the world today is we're out of balance. We're out of balance. There's too many people going towards the narcissism end, which emotionally is envy, but then you have a lot of people on the empathetic end, which is the emotion is pride. And when you think about that from that perspective, is Superman a balance? Like when he's balanced, he has his parents who they raised him that he could go to them for support if he needed it. And he did. And they were there for him. And then when he was a superhero in the comics, he did what was best for humanity, but he also did what was best for himself. So he had that yin-yang balance between being able to be a person who does care about humanity, but he needs his own. He can't just be all empathetic. So he can't just be all narcissism either, all for myself. So one of the things that's interesting about that, when the Waynes die, and they're murdered just like they are in the comic, Superman is just a boy, and he goes, his empathetic side becomes totalitarian because he moves past pride into I don't want anyone to die, and then you start getting vengeful.
Right, more like Batman. So,
right,
and for those of you who are listening,
version.
Those of you who are listening who are have not been pulled into the comic book universe by the superhero grief book or weren't there already, the whole conversation that we have around superhero grief is about how we all can be our own superheroes after a tragedy, but superheroes are not perfect. And as someone who wasn't, I did get Batman. Like, he's the guy that's probably been in my life the most as far as all the superheroes. And I got his shadow side because Batman can be very vengeful. And he witnessed, at least in the movies, I'm not sure how it was in the comic books, but he witnessed his parents' murder. And that
in the comics, it was the same.
Okay. And that will change you. And with with Superman, his origin story in the movies, because that's what I know, is his world was being taken over and destroyed. His parents sent him to Earth so he could live, and then they died, and he landed in a cornfield and was raised by his human parents and was nurtured. And so there was a very different upbringing. And I think the question you're bringing up, and I think it's a question that a lot of those of us who have lost loved ones, significant loved ones, and possibly even when we look at the suit with Batman and Superman, we're looking at parent loss. What part of us is who we are now because of the loss itself? What part of us is who we are now because of our upbringing? And the answer is probably it's all connected, right? It's everything. Connected. Yeah. And when we think about the mediators of grief and mourning that William Worden writes about in his grief counseling and grief therapy book, it's a really long list of all the different aspects of your life that impact how you grieve and how you mourn. Everything from your upbringing, your social support, your financial support, whether you're an optimist or a pessimist, like all of that stuff matters.
Right. And it's something that it's where it gets fascinating from the superhero aspect is because you're dealing with people with powers beyond our own. But even then, their powers are limited. So in the film, Superman was able to bring back Lois after she passed. But in the comics, that's not always the case. And that's sort of the fascinating part about Superman as a character, is that many of the writers have taken and said, well, let's take him out of this, scenario where he was raised by two loving parents. And even though he lost his parents on Krypton, he had some influence from them. What if we put him in Soviet Russia? What if we lose Lois at some point? That was the game that's out, if anybody's a gamer. That was called, what was it?
I'm not allowed to play games because I almost failed out of college because of Tetris.
Because of Tetris.
Yeah. Little side note.
Yeah, it's one of the things that when you're at that age in the 80s and in the 90s, because I was in school from 89 to 93. It was still the big machines, but you had you still had Atari and stuff like that. But I
had the best machines, which is why I'm a computer nerd now. But anyway, oh my gosh. Well, we won't go. Games, I can't even imagine what I wouldn't get done if I had access to games. But let's coming back to just that idea of putting Superman in Soviet Russia or in different places to bring it back to us.
Yeah, well, and that's what was interesting about those stories is that, again, you still have the tragedy of, you still have the loss because he's lost his parents. And again, you're putting him in a situation where instead of him landing in Kansas, he lands in the Ukraine. And that's Red Sun was the name of the story. And then he, again, I think that there's something about Superman which is, and you can't take that empathy away from him, because it's innate in the character, his love for humanity and his caring. It's just that it can always be taken too far. And what the whole point of the grieving process is to get to acceptance. And where they try to explore that in his character and where it mirrors our own is he never gets there in some instances. Yeah. He doesn't get to acceptance. And that just keeps him on that loop between anger and depression and denial, and then just keeps going over and over and over and over and over again. And he just can't get to acceptance. And then something jars him there and then changes the character and allows him to go through. And circling all the way back to the Baroque and the Sinister, his descent, loss, and all the things that when he got to the bottom of the cross between Baroque and Sinister, that's where you have your choice you have to make, and that's a fascinating part of the character.
It's also a fascinating and painful and difficult part of grief.
Yes,
and I want to just give I like to give a mindfulness definition of acceptance. Especially for people who are really early in. It doesn't mean you're okay with what happened or that you would prefer that. I mean,
it didn't.
Yeah, it's that there's this idea that it didn't happen or that you're fighting against reality. And I think of a mindful acceptance is it might be like just putting your hand on your heart and saying, this hurts. Right. That's also an acceptance. And you mentioned choice, and nobody chooses to lose a loved one, just like none of your clients choose to have undergone a medical procedure that went sideways or be in an accident. But when we're talking about choice, it's when you're ready, like when you've been able to cultivate some coping skills so you can sleep at night and digest food and function day to day. It is that whole, what do I do with this? And, the superheroes, a lot of times they go out and, either in Batman's case, kind of get a little
get his anger
vigilante. In Superman's case, he just has a lot of compassion for humans. And, this is the place he was raised. And, he's a refugee who really appreciates the humankind. And he chooses to, because he also has the power to
be able to affect change at some point.
Change. And that doesn't mean that everybody everybody in the world needs to become Superman or Wonder Woman or any of that. But we find our ways. This circles back to what you brought up at the beginning about meaning.
Yeah.
To live a meaningful, mindful, healthy, compassionate life in spite of this very tragic, painful thing that you've had to navigate.
Well, it defines us. Our mortality defines our existence.
Yeah.
And that time that we had with the loved ones that we've lost, it becomes more important, and it becomes more part of who we are. That pain is a necessity in order for you to move. You have to move through, and I know it can be 5 steps or some.
There's no steps actually for our purposes. No steps.
There are no steps, because I know this Kubler-Ross model is 5 or 7 steps.
Right, but that model so you might find this fascinating as someone who works with medical patients. The Kubler-Ross model was actually her watching people die and what they went through.
I wasn't aware of that.
No, a lot of people aren't. And so as a thanatologist, it is my job to help educate. And we love her. She was a pioneer, because when she was doing her work, dying patients were treated like lab rats. They were she writes of people being left in rooms 24 hours with the lights on and just one sheet. It's heartbreaking.
That's
the stuff she witnessed. It was horrible. And she writes about that, and she would interview these people, and then she would go train doctors on the humanity of people who were dying, which, it's kind of like right now, and it's kind of hard to imagine that, right? Like, how did they not realize that these,
they were mistreating them.
Yeah. And, who knows, maybe anyway, that's probably a whole other conversation, but the five things she came up with were how dying people were feeling. And she writes in the intro, it's like just a blurb, but she writes, this is not comprehensive, nor is it grounded in research. It's her observations. So studies have been done since then to see, are these the 5 stages, right? Because it got translated into grief.
Right.
And anyway, I can go on and on about it. But what we know now in contemporary world, which, the 5 Stages book came out not that long ago, right? In the grand scheme of things, that was like in the 50s, I think, or 60s. I should know this, but just forgive me, people. But what we know now, and there are task models that have maybe steps or things like that, but they're not considered stages in the same way. It's more like you probably need to do this. It's more of an invitation, really, in a way. And one of my favorite ones is I mentioned William Worden earlier. He has 4 tasks of mourning. And the first is to accept the reality of the loss. And that means the stark reality. Like, many of us have had the experience where in the first day or 2 or week or month, the phone rings and we expect it to be our loved one. And then we look at the phone and we realize, oh my God, they're not going to call. Like, we're talking about that type of reality. Mm-hmm. And then the second thing is to process the pain of the loss. Mm-hmm. And then the third is to adjust to a world without the person who died, which can be everything from the secondary losses of, I have to take out the trash now. I have to find someone to cover me when my kids need help. There's different things. And then the final one is to find an enduring connection with the person who died while continuing your life.
That's fascinating. But and that almost makes more sense as far as the movement through the stages.
Doesn't it?
That's a better model, it sounds like to me.
Well, also the problem with the 5-stage model is not everybody feels angry. Not everybody feels, a lot of people feel angry when their loved ones die, but not everybody. Like, for instance, when my grandmother died, I didn't feel angry because why? She'd lived a good life. I expected it. I'd made peace with that. Whereas when someone's spouse dies suddenly, they might feel really angry. Why did this happen? There's different textures. And what I like about Worden's task model, and many of the other ones, like Bob Niemeyer has, like all the great grief therapists have one. I even have one. My mindfulness and grief system is my mindfulness way, but it's definitely gives homage to the other greats as well, is it doesn't tell you have to feel a certain way. Because going back to all those mediators, like what if Superman was a Wayne?
Right.
His temperament might be different.
His temperament is going to be different.
Yeah. So thank you for letting me share that, because I love talking about these models. And
I one of the things that we had discussed earlier was that for some reason or another, and I think it has a lot to do with the fact that we're so immersed in not only the medicine, but the psychology of being able to translate it. Everybody in the office has now become sort of a psychology minor. So we've been spending all this time. I have my senior medical illustrator and myself and a few other people in the office. We swap psychology books all day.
Oh, wow.
And so we can't read it because we're too busy drawing. So one of the things that artists like to do is they either have music in the background when they're painting, or they're rendering, or they're doing 3D, or whatever it is that they're doing. When you're doing medical research, you can't have anything that is distracting, because it requires very intense focus on making sure that what you're going to render has to be accurate. The accuracy is one of the most important things. However, once you've gotten past the figured it out part, you get to the point where you're like, okay, well, now I'm just rendering for 14 hours and I'm just drawing for 14 hours. So you sit there and you just sort of, you're doing your thing, but your mind wanders. So what we do is we have a library of thousands of audiobooks, and we just sit and we sort of secondary educate ourselves while we're drawing. And we've just been on a kick for like the past 5-6 years on psychology. And I'll tell you, it's been one of the most rewarding things to do as a side, just understanding psychology. I think it's one of the most important disciplines for humanity, because what it does is it explains the human condition. Mm-hmm. Right now, I just got done reading Gabor Mate's book on addiction. Wow. And I was reading simultaneously. I was sort of going back and forth between that and Eckhart Tolle's Power of Now, and they're kind of hot right now. So I was especially Gabor Mate. He's really getting quite a lot out there. But when I heard about your podcast and I thought of mindfulness, I was really sort of equating that to the thinking of the sort of the Buddhist idea of being in the now and stuff that Gabor Mate talks about, and that it's an important part of the acceptance that living in the now. You don't live in the past because living in the past does not allow you to get to acceptance. Living in the future is an anxiety that you don't know what's going to happen, but that you don't have any control over that because it's not now. You only have control over now. Right. And when you refer to mindfulness, is that the idea? Is that the concept?
Yeah, you nailed it. And it is about letting go of the things you can't change or have no control over, and tending to the things that you do. And I think of art as a very mindful process. Like, I love that you said I know that you're doing medical, which is somewhat nonfiction art, we'll call it. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, it is, because it has to be the accuracy. Mm-hmm. And it is nonfiction, right, in the sense that you can't make stuff up. Right. You have to.
And so you do need to be
a certain thing.
You got to be very present. You can't be lost in fantasy. Because I think of it's that the past and the future are two places we go a lot. We also go to fantasy, to things that,
we're never,
or almost like these dream states, I
had a friend of mine that said it was the fantasy of the never was.
Yeah.
Was the phrase. And the getting lost in those ideas is a tertiary. It's not the past. It's not the future. Yeah. It's alternate fantasy. Realities.
Yeah, it is. And we go there, I think, a lot with grief, especially like what you said, what didn't ever happen or what will never happen, which can be a little bit of past future, but we don't need to split hairs over where our brains go other than the present. But I love that you get the importance of that. And, for those of you who are listening, Ron and I met through Jill, the superhero grief person. And what I love about our conversation is you're one of the few non-grief experts that I get to talk to. And so, we're
so
both
outside of that. Yeah.
Outside. And so we're kind of both opening each other's eyes. And even though I'm technically supposed to know something about art, there's things I'm certainly missing as well. And, you're talking about psychology and art. My senior thesis, which is lost forever, even though the college said, we will always keep your thesis on file.
Oh, they lost it?
It's gone.
Do you have a copy?
No, that's why I called them.
Oh, geez.
So my senior thesis, and I was not I didn't know what thanatology was. I had been bereaved. I'd lost people, but it was not on my radar as a career or life goal. I was an art history major. I was going to go work in a museum, right?
Well, that's kind of the fantasy of a lot of artists.
Yeah, by the way, that's really
it's not
tough.
reality.
I think actually, we won't go down that road either.
Well, just to say, look, it's hard. It's one of those things. It's very really hard. It's very nepotistic. You got to know someone if you're going to be in those.
And back
fields.
then, and probably now, it was very chauvinistic and sexist. And so was the gallery world. The gallery world is what turned me off from art. But I want to come back to death and dying. And I don't mean turn me off from art. I still love art.
No.
I just don't want to work in it. My paper was on the Beata Beatrix by Dante Gabriel Rossetti, which was a Pre-Raphaelite art piece. And a lot of people look at Pre-Raphaelite art. It's very pretty, very decorative, but a lot of the models and particularly the Elizabeth, who is featured in that painting, had tuberculosis and were dying or overdosed from the opioid that was given them to cure it.
Yeah, and they didn't even understand what they were doing.
They had no idea what they were doing. And my paper led me to go to NIH. And I actually went to the medical archives and read books from the late 1800s, mid to late 1800s on tuberculosis and read books on outlooks of death and dying and bereavement, and wrote this it must have been a great paper. It got an award, a book award from the school.
Wow.
We'll never know.
And then they lose it. It's such a great paper. We love it so much. We put it somewhere in a drawer and we don't know where it is now.
Right. But, there was a lot, even though this is a very beautiful, decorative, pretty style, there was some death and dying undertones. For sure.
And that would be one of the things that would be fascinating and I do this with one of the things when I go to a museum, and anybody can do this. Essentially, what I would do is I would hand out to the students a small, it would be like the size of the back of a phone screen. So where you would have your smartphone, you'd have that screen size. And then what it was it's the golden ratio on a small, just acetate piece of cellophane. And you just hold it up and go to every single piece of art and hold up this piece of cellophane, because they don't want you taking pictures. No. So you can bring this little piece of cellophane though, and you can hold it up and hold your eye up to it and say, "Oh my God! Like there's the figure of Christ coming off the cross, and it's on the ascendant, on the descendant, on the not on the Baroque. So it's on the sinister rather." But let's say if Christ is ascending to heaven, so you can't go through. I remember it was when we went through the Louvre back when I was backpacking. It was just, I wish I understood it back then, because I got this education years later. But I would have just sat there and probably been in that museum for a week with that.
just holding up your thing.
Yeah, like holding your thing. Okay, does this represent, like, did the artist want to have, like, did they want to see the movement where it was actually pulling you down and making you feel this emotion of pain? Or were they trying to lift you up and have you understand the ascent of Christ into heaven, or the ascent of whatever the figure was. And it's so prevalent in all art, but especially in Renaissance art, where it really sort of, this technique took off. But you can go all the way back to the Greeks. The Greeks were using it as well. The representation of the golden ratio, phi, the Greek symbol for phi, is named after the guy who designed the the architect who did the Temple of Zeus. So it's one of the 7 ancient wonders that's lost. But it was all designed in phi ratio. Architecture, art, music, it's all within that.
I'm realizing one thing we can do, and unfortunately we're coming to the close of our time together, but one thing that we can do is include that golden ratio on the show notes page, because I think the art homework that I'm going to encourage people to do is to take this knowledge of the 2 lines, the sinister and the Baroque, and take that golden ratio and do a little bit of art therapy for yourself. I was even thinking with the golden ratio, you could, is golden ratio the right thing, or do we say golden rectangle? What's the right terminology?
No, both are right. Correct.
Okay, yeah. You could take that, and then you could even throw the Nautilus line. What do you call that thing? I'm swirling.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. Those are the 2.
We'll put something up.
The curve, yeah.
Maybe what I can do is I'll put up a template for you all. It'll just be like nerdy science math template, but you can take it and grab some crayons, colored pencils, some collage material, and maybe, think about your grief experience and fill in, different aspects. It could almost be like a mandala. Of your emotions, your experience, whatever you feel like drawing, using those as guides, because just to circle back to the nothing's more intimidating than a blank page, that'll give you something to work with that isn't a blank page. And I'd be curious.
What they would be doing was they would be doing that which every artist should start. That is the starting point for every piece of artwork, painting, drawing, otherwise. It should always start with that.
Yeah.
And that'd be wonderful for them to be able to utilize that to express their emotions through art.
I love it. I think this is a great idea. So Ron, where can they find you to learn more about what you do or to connect with you?
Well, if anybody wants to connect with me, my company name is called Anatomical Justice. You can go to www.anatomicaljustice.com. It has our phone number and our email there. It has my little bio there, and a lot of my employees are there. They're all there too. And it's one of the things that if you're a student or you're someone who's interested in the field, send me a note. Give me a call. I'm always up to speaking with people who are interested in the field, and I should probably spend more time working rather than talking to students like that. But I end up doing it anyway because I absolutely love the teaching process and telling people about the medium, because it's really something that I think has so many different purposes. Yeah. I mean, it's not just communicating science. It's also communicating these emotional states. And it ties in with art, just the classical art, so much. Trying to merge those two disciplines together is really my raison d'etre. So that's that. There you go.
It was a very artsy word for you to end on. So thank you for that. Well, Ron, it's been a real pleasure. And also, everybody pick up the Superhero Grief book. There's a link to it on my website, or just go and ponder the cover, because we'll have the full cover up on my website as well.
I'll have to send you that.
Yeah, that'd be great. All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you so much. I had a wonderful time.
Thank you for listening to the Mindfulness and Grief podcast. Please help us spread the word and subscribe to this podcast, or even write a review. A special thank you goes to our podcast engineer, Todd Campbell of Hub City Recording, and to the Atomic Mosquitoes, who provide our theme music. This podcast is a service of the Mindfulness and Grief Institute. Visit us at mindfulnessandgrief.com to download your free copy of Navigating Grief and to learn more about our Awaken Meditation for Grief group and one-on-one support. I am your host, Heather Stang. May you find some peace in knowing you are not alone. And please be gentle with your grieving heart as you move through the rest of your day.